Imagine breaking a serious rule thousands of years ago. There were no police waiting around the settlement. There were no prisons built to hold criminals. There were no courts with lawyers and judges. So what happened when someone committed a crime? The answer depended entirely on the community around them. Small groups could not simply lock dangerous people away. Everyone still depended on each other for survival. A thief could threaten the group's limited food supply. A violent person could put everyone else in danger. Even breaking an important rule could create conflict. So communities needed ways to control dangerous behavior. Sometimes punishment came from the entire group. Sometimes the victim's family demanded revenge. And sometimes the offender simply had to leave. Being expelled could become extremely dangerous outside the group. There was no supermarket waiting beyond the settlement. There was no guaranteed shelter for someone living alone. Survival depended heavily on belonging to other people. But what was the harshest punishment ancient communities could give? In small communities, everyone usually knew what happened. There was nowhere to hide after breaking an important rule. Neighbors could quickly notice strange behavior. Victims could explain what had happened to everyone. The group then had to decide what came next. Sometimes the offender was simply confronted directly. An apology could be enough for a minor offense, but serious offenses demanded stronger consequences. The community might demand compensation for stolen goods. The offender could also lose someone's trust. That loss could become more painful than physical punishment. Everyone depended on cooperation to survive. Being treated as untrustworthy could isolate someone quickly. But what happened when trust was completely destroyed? Sometimes the community chose to remove the offender. Exile meant leaving everyone who could provide support, food, shelter, protection, and companionship disappeared together. For a solitary person, that could become deadly. Yet exile was not always the harshest option. Some crimes demanded something much more frightening. Physical punishment was not always the first choice. Communities sometimes wanted offenders to understand their mistakes. Public shame could make punishment impossible to ignore. Everyone would remember what the offender had done. That reputation could follow someone for years. But shame worked only when people cared about acceptance. What if someone simply refused to feel ashamed? Then the community needed something more powerful. Some societies used physical punishment to enforce important rules. The severity depended on the offense and community. A minor theft could receive a lighter consequence. Violence against another member could demand much more, but punishment also carried a dangerous possibility. What happened when punishment itself became unfair? Without formal courts, decisions could depend on powerful families. Personal revenge could quickly become another form of violence. One injury could lead to another. Then another family might demand revenge again. A single crime could therefore create generations of conflict, and humans eventually needed a way to stop it. Revenge could begin with one simple act of violence. The victim's family might demand justice in return. Another injury could then create another demand. Soon, punishment became impossible to separate from revenge. Entire families could become involved in old conflicts. Children could inherit hatred they never. A single crime could therefore divide an entire community, but small groups could not survive endless internal violence. They needed rules that everyone could recognize. Someone had to decide when revenge had gone too far. That responsibility sometimes belonged to respected elders. Their authority could prevent conflicts from becoming blood feuds. Instead of revenge, offenders might owe compensation. The punishment could involve goods, animals, or valuable resources. This gave victims something without creating another victim. But compensation only worked when both sides accepted it. Some crimes were considered too serious for payment. Murder could demand consequences that money could never satisfy. So communities needed increasingly complicated rules. And eventually, those rules began appearing in written laws. Written laws changed how ancient communities handled serious crimes. Rules could now survive beyond the memory of elders. People could see exactly what certain offenses deserved. Punishment was no longer based entirely on personal revenge. Some ancient laws demanded compensation for specific injuries. Others prescribed harsher consequences for serious offenses. The punishment could depend on someone's social position. That made ancient justice very different from ours. Not everyone stood equally before the law, but written rules still created something important. They gave communities a shared standard for punishment. People could no longer claim ignorance so easily. Authorities could point directly to established rules. Yet written laws created another difficult question. Who had the power to enforce them? Someone needed authority to investigate serious offenses. Someone also needed to decide whether accusations were true, and someone had to carry out the punishment. That created the earliest forms of organized justice. But ancient punishments could become surprisingly severe. Some ancient laws demanded harsh punishment for serious offenses. Physical punishment could become part of public justice. The goal was often deterrence rather than revenge. People needed to understand that certain actions had consequences. Some punishments targeted the offender's body directly. Others focused on property, status, or social position. A person's punishment could depend on their social rank. That made ancient justice deeply unequal, but severity was not always the same everywhere. Different societies created completely different rules. Some preferred compensation instead of physical punishment. Others relied heavily on exile and public shame. Some crimes could even result in execution. Death removed the offender from the community permanently. But execution created another important question. Who decided that someone deserved to die? Without modern investigations, accusations could be difficult to prove. False accusations could therefore become extremely dangerous. Justice depended heavily on whoever held authority. And sometimes, power mattered more than truth. Accusing someone was easy, but proving guilt was much harder. Ancient communities had no fingerprints or modern forensic laboratories. Witnesses often became extremely important during serious disputes. Someone who saw the crime could influence the decision, but witnesses could also misunderstand what they saw. Fear could make people change their stories. Powerful people could also pressure weaker witnesses. So how could ancient authorities discover the truth? Some societies relied on oaths before trusted authorities. Others used physical tests to determine guilt. These methods could seem strange by modern standards, yet people believed supernatural forces could reveal hidden truth. A person might be forced to prove innocence. Failure could sometimes be treated as evidence of guilt. This made ancient justice incredibly dangerous for suspects. The accused could suffer even without clear evidence, but authorities also needed ways to protect themselves. A wrong decision could create another serious conflict. So punishment was never simply about hurting criminals. It was also about controlling fear within society. A serious accusation could divide an entire community. Everyone wanted justice, but nobody wanted another conflict. The accused could deny everything before the gathered community. The victim could explain exactly what had happened. Witnesses could then describe what they remembered seeing. Elders might compare the different stories carefully. Every detail could change the final decision, but emotions could make peaceful judgment extremely difficult. Angry relatives might demand immediate revenge. Others might fear punishing an innocent person. The community therefore needed someone trusted enough to decide. That authority could come from age, reputation, or position. Sometimes several respected people decided together. Their goal was not always perfect justice. Sometimes they simply needed to restore peace. Compensation could settle disputes without further violence. Exile could remove someone who threatened the community. Severe punishment could discourage others from copying them. But every decision carried consequences for everyone. Because ancient justice was really about keeping society together. Sometimes the community could no longer trust the offender. Keeping that person nearby could create greater danger. So the community could choose to remove them. Exile meant leaving behind everyone they depended upon. Food became harder to find without group cooperation. Protection from predators also became much more difficult. Even finding shelter could become a serious challenge. The punishment worked because humans depended heavily on community. A person outside the group could become extremely vulnerable, but exile was not always permanent. Some communities could eventually allow an offender to return. That might require apology, compensation, or changed behavior. The goal was sometimes restoring relationships rather than destroying them. But serious crimes could make forgiveness impossible. A violent offender might never be welcomed again. This made exile both simple and powerful. No prison walls were necessary. The entire wilderness became the punishment. Yet ancient societies eventually developed another solution. They began creating places specifically designed to hold offenders. Eventually, some societies began holding offenders in enclosed places. These spaces were different from simple punishment or exile. The offender could remain inside while authorities controlled them. But early prisons were not designed like modern ones. Many were dark, crowded, and extremely unpleasant. Some prisoners depended on relatives for food. Others became completely dependent on their captors. Prison could therefore become punishment by itself. Yet imprisonment was not always the final sentence. Some people were held only until judgment. Others waited there before facing harsher punishment. The purpose depended heavily on the society involved. Over time, imprisonment became increasingly organized. Authorities could separate dangerous people from everyone else. That solved one ancient problem: controlling offenders without exile. But prisons created another question. Could punishment actually change someone's behavior? Or were humans simply becoming better at controlling criminals? Thousands of years later, that question still remains, because every society must decide what justice truly means.